So today, the focus will be on reflective listening and summarizing. Myself, Tejdeepika, I'm working as a psychologist with VK and Nimans. So learning objectives, like I mentioned, it is to orient all of you with what is reflective listening. We have planned out two activities for how to go about forming reflections, because the focus should be on building practical skills, and also an activity for summarizing. Okay, so OARS, I think we've been hearing a lot about OARS over the different ECHO programs, as well as in the past few sessions of MI. So it is a set of interactive skills, mainly to foster empathetic environment where the client is able to explore, change, and grow. So today the focus will be typically on reflective listening and summarizing. Okay, so let's quickly begin. So, what is reflective listening? So, one of the best ways of expressing empathy is through reflective listening. So, what is this reflective listening? It involves making a hypothesis about the underlying meaning of the client's statement, and you're making a reasonable guess about it and reflecting it back to your client. Okay, in simple words, it's about mirroring back whatever the client has told in a non judgmental manner. Now, why is reflective listening important? Firstly, it helps the client feel that my therapist is genuinely interested in understanding and accepting my perspective and feelings. Secondly, it brings forth a safe place for the client to express his concerns and challenges, so that we'll be in a better position to empower him and move him towards change. And most importantly, there is the most important benefit of reflective listening is that when you employ the skill of reflective listening, you will be able to demonstrate empathy and understanding, even if you don't typically agree with any specific client statement. If there's anything that you don't agree with the client statement as well, you will be able to demonstrate empathy and understanding. So going forward, we'll understand a little about how do we go about forming reflections? What are certain rules that we need to keep in mind? Why do we need to do it? And how do we do it is something we'll talk about now. Firstly, stay present and focused. So as a clinician, ensure that you stay in the moment, stay present and focused. What happens with this is that you are demonstrating that you're listening and understanding the client's perspective. And how do you do it? You need to ensure that you minimize distractions. You need to ensure that you use both verbal and non-verbal cues when you're engaging with your client. Reflect what the client says. So each time you reflect what your client says, the client is going to feel heard and understood. It also provides an opportunity for the therapist, which is us, to clarify the client's thoughts and emotions. So how do we do this? You need to paraphrase or restate whatever the client has told you without changing its meaning. Next is reflect feelings and emotions. Now, when we say reflect, it is not just about the content. We also reflect the feelings and emotions. So what does it mean? We reflect not just what the client says, but we also reflect on how the client says it. For example, the client's tone, the client's body language, the pace at which the client is making a given statement. So it's also about reflecting feelings and emotions. Use simple reflections to start with. So early on in the process, it's always advisable to use simple reflections to start with, mainly to understand that we have understood the client's perspective. So the first thing is that the client will feel that my therapist is understanding my challenges and my perspective. And as a therapist, it will be helpful for you to start with simple reflection without overcomplicating things. So it's always advisable to start with simple reflections. Next is when you encourage your client to expand on thoughts, what you're doing is you are helping the client gain more insights about their own experiences, their motivation, and contradictory feelings. So, how do you go about doing this? You're going to use open ended questions, inviting client to elaborate further. So, these are the rules about forming reflections. So, I hope we are clear up till now. Okay, now we'll quickly, I'll slow down a little bit here because, it's very important that we understand the different types of reflections. So mainly, we talk about two types of reflections, simple and complex. Simple reflections, it's pretty simple and straightforward. That is, you restate whatever the client has told, without adding any new information or interpretation. Those are simple reflections. So two things that you need to remember about simple reflection. One is the phrase repeat, and the other one is rephrase. In repeat, you basically state whatever the client has told you. Let us consider an example. So the client says, I want to start taking my medication again. So as a therapist, you make this statement. You want to start taking your medication again. So here the therapist is just restating whatever the client has stated. Now in rephrase, the therapist will slightly alter or slightly change what the client has said. For example, I really want to start taking my medication again. So the therapist or the helper says, taking your medication is very important to you. So just keep in mind, with simple reflection, it's straightforward without any information adding or interpretation. So we'll take a look at the complex reflections. So in complex reflections, these are the reflections which lead to deeper understanding and deeper exploration of the client's concerns. So what does complex reflection involve? So it is typically more than just paraphrasing or restating. Here in complex reflections, what you're doing is you're making a hypothesis about the client's statement. You're making a guess about what the client probably is saying and reflected back to the client. So in simple words, if I have to tell you about complex reflections, it's client statement plus the hypothesis that you have made. Okay, so we'll quickly go through the different types of complex reflections. The first is amplified reflection, as the word itself suggests. Whatever the client states, you're going to state it in an exaggerated way. It can be over exaggeration or under exaggeration. So let us consider this example. I'm here because my girlfriend made me come here. So the therapist said, that's the only reason why you are here. That's one example of an amplified reflection. Now, the next is double-sided reflection. As the name itself suggests, here what the therapist does is he reflects and taps on both the sides of the client's ambivalence. So what the therapist does here, he reflects on pros and cons of a person continuing to use the substance. He reflects the reasons for changing and the reasons for remaining same. Basically, in double-sided reflection, just remember one thing. The therapist is trying to address the ambivalence, basically trying to address the internal conflict of the client. So let's take an example. So the client here is saying, I want to quit smoking, but I feel it's the only thing that helps me relax after a stressful day at work. So here the therapist, what he's going to do now, he's going to tap on both the sides of the ambivalence. That is, you feel that smoking helps you relax after a stressful day, but you do realize that it can be harmful and you would like to quit it. So here they are tapping on both the sides of the ambivalence. The next is siding with negative, pretty self-explanatory. Here, what the therapist does is he intentionally reflects on the negative or the resistant perspective of a client, but ensure that it is done in a non-judgmental and an empathetic way. So here, what the therapist does is he acknowledges the resistance, although it is against the desired outcome. Now, this does not mean that the therapist is supporting or promoting negative behavior. He is just trying to demonstrate understanding for the client. So let's take an example. Client says, I know I smoke a lot, but it's not that bad. I've been smoking for years and it has not caused me any real problems yet. So here the therapist says, you're thinking that smoking hasn't caused any major issues for you as yet, and maybe it's not something you need to worry about right now. So you can see the therapist is trying to reflect on the resistant perspective, but in an empathetic way. So these are the three complex reflections we have covered. We'll proceed with the next. Next is shifting focus reflection. Here, you are redirecting the client's attention from a resistant or an unproductive topic to something that's more relevant. Now, when do we use this shifting focus reflection? We need to keep this in mind. We typically use shifting focus reflection when we have a client who's constantly talking only about barriers or obstacles. We often hear, client make statements like, I think I'm too old to make changes. Or, might have a client who's very fixated with external factors. Probably is constantly blaming others, or probably he, blames it on unavoidable circumstances. So in such circumstances, try using shifting focus reflection, where you're trying to redirect the client's attention. There is an example here. So let me give you another example for shifting focus. So for example, client makes this statement. I've always messed with healthy eating. I feel I can't stick to it. I think I lack willpower. So the therapist says, you've always had instances where you have, it sounds like you have been really frustrated with the difficulties of healthy eating. But can you think about instances where you have had, minor success, or with handling those situations? Here, what we are doing is we are temporarily trying to redirect the client's attention from resistance to something more productive. That is shifting focus reflection. Next is reframing, as the word itself suggests. Here, you're presenting a altogether new or a different perspective to the client, hoping to provide a more hopeful interpretation of a situation. Like, for example, the client says, "I can't quit smoking. My anxiety is too high, and smoking helps me relax." Now, here, let's see how the therapist will give a different perspective. It sounds like smoking is helping you manage anxiety, but if I wonder if there might be other ways you can find relief that does not rely on smoking. You've shown that you're looking for ways to deal with stress, which is a sign of your strength and willingness to find alternatives. So, if you take a clear look at the example, we can see how the client has given a different interpretation altogether, different perspective altogether. For example, towards the end, the therapist is tapping on the strengths of the client. The fact that you're looking for new alternatives to deal with stress, it's a sign that you are ready. It's a sign of you being strong and willing to find alternatives. So he's tapping on the strengths of the client. That is regarding the reframing technique. The next is agreeing with the twist. Here, you are acknowledging the client's statement, and then gradually, as with passage of time, what you do is you introduce a subtle shift to broaden their view or suggest alternatives. For example, "I can't imagine myself not drinking. It's a part of who I am, how I escape, and helps me through the day." So the therapist makes this statement: "You can't live your life without drinking. It's such a part of who you are that you will always keep drinking no matter what the cost." Here again, the therapist is agreeing or acknowledging the client's statement, but with a twist. You can see for the latter half of the example where you will keep drinking no matter what the cost. Trying to give a subtle shift. Now, metaphor, as the word indicates, you use symbolic language to illustrate complex thoughts, emotions, or behaviors. So, for example, you can see the statement here. It sounds like you're carrying around a heavy backpack full of past mistakes. So you use metaphors in order to, reflect on complex thoughts or emotions. So so far we have covered complex reflections. We often he compares the change talk statements made by the client to floods. Initially, when the client starts off the conversation with you, it's very minimal. But as a therapist, it's important that you gather all of these change talk statements, because eventually you will be using it when you converse with your client. And you will use, like, we've used the analogy of flowers in larger bouquets mainly for planning and recapitulation. Now, why is summarizing important? Why is it important to reflect back on the key points? Firstly, it helps us clarify and reinforce the key points. It also promotes reflection and awareness on part of the client. It makes sure that the therapeutic alliance is based on solid foundation, and also client feels more understood and heard. It also provides an opportunity for the therapist to organize the information that has been shared in the session, and also sets the stage for further conversations with the client. So it's very important to have this summarizing skill. Now, how to summarize? These are certain things you can keep in mind. So before you begin with statements, what you need to do is that always ensure that you begin with statements that you're indicating that you are proceeding towards providing a summary. For example, "Tell me if I have missed something." And when you're summarizing, try and give more emphasis to change or positive statements. And also at the same time, if the person is expressing ambivalence, try to include both of those statements in the summary statement. And also, it is also very important to provide information from other sources in the summary statement. For example, it can be from your clinical experience, it can be from your research, and try and understand, what is the status of the client's understanding. Now, end with the invitation. Did I miss anything? So, depending on the response of your client, you can transition to next step. So, briefly, I have summarized how you need to go about providing a gist about what has been covered in the conversation. Okay, now I'll quickly go through the simple, few types of summaries. The first is collecting summary. Here, what you're doing is you're organizing information. You're bringing together all the key points that has happened during the conversation. For example, so far you've talked about your frustration with your job, your desire to spend more time with family, and your struggle with managing stress. So here, what the therapist is doing is the therapist is bringing forth all the key points from different parts of the conversation, collecting. Now, in linking summary, what the therapist does is he tries to connect all the pieces of information that the client has shared at different points of time, and shows how they're interrelated or how they influence one another. Like, for example, you mentioned that you are feeling stressed at work, you tend to smoke more. You also said that quitting smoking could improve your health and help you feel more in control of your life. So you can see how the therapist is connecting one piece of information to another to show how it's influencing one another. Now, transitional summary is basically you're shifting focus from one area to another. Like, for example, we have discussed some of the challenges you're facing. Let us now talk about the challenges you're thinking about making and how you might start taking action. So, these are the three things. There's also ambivalence summary where you summarize both sustained talk statements as well as change talk statements. But the most important thing is, as a therapist, try highlighting the change talk statements, although you acknowledge the sustained talk statements as well. Another statement component is recapitulation, which basically is about transition. So basically, you emphasize more on the change talk that has happened and try to transition into planning. So thank you for actively listening. So to summarize, it's very important that by mastering these skills, we'll be able to create an environment where the person is able to grow, and most importantly, we will be able to move the person towards change. So it's very important to ensure that we practice these techniques in our conversation with our client, because it's an opportunity for us to improve, our skills as well. Thank you so much for your active listening.